And as I said before in our other ones, I know a lot of you come to these, been to many of them, and we try and give you a good window into the variety of operations that we have in agriculture here in Ventura County. And you won't be disappointed today. We have quite a different kind of operation. And we have Casey Howling here today to talk to us about Howling Tomatoes and what they've done out on the Oxnard Plain. It's a fascinating project. And I think rather than me spending any time talking about it, I'll ask Casey to come up and get started, introduce himself, and talk about his operation.
All right, thank you. First of all, I'd just like to say thanks for having me here today. I think it is important that those who serve us and through whether it's the county or any of the other services we use, it's important for them to know who the people are, the users at the other end, and to understand each other. I think oftentimes what we do is we always complain about government. And a lot of reasons we complain is because we don't understand it. Some are legit, and some are probably legit the other way around. So I hope to make this an informative session so that you guys feel a little bit as proud as we actually do to have our operation here in this county. So I'll just go figure out how this fancy electronic stuff works. Us farmers don't use these things very often, but so I just got a short agenda here. I may stick with it, I may not. It just depends on how it goes. So I'll just talk a little bit about our history. First of all, I'm actually a Canadian. I was born in Vancouver, and I actually live up there. So that may be a good or a bad thing. It just depends. But we came down here in 1996 from Canada. We have still have our original operation up there in Canada, and we have one down here. So the first thing I would say is why did we come down here? Well, the main reason we came down here is because hothouse produce, tomatoes in particular, were becoming more and more of a staple in the stores, displacing field products for a number of reasons that I'll touch on later on. California was becoming a bigger market for us, so we were shipping tomatoes down from California. But the problem that Canada has, it's far north. The days are shorter in the wintertime. And particularly Vancouver ends up raining a lot, something you don't have here, something you probably wished you had a bit more of here. So we cannot grow up there, at least in 1996. You can't grow up there for about 3 months or produce for about 3 months of the year just because there's not enough light. For those of you who know plants, light's essential in the process of growing, as is CO2 and as is fertilizer and water. So you have all those ingredients, and if you have one of those out of balance, you haven't got anything. So 1% lights, 1% production equated to the way we grow in greenhouses. So that's why it was important to be down south here. We can grow 12 months out of the year. Great area. We actually went as far south as Mexico originally and ended up doing a joint venture just in Culiacan. But the cultural differences for us as a Canadian company were just too great. There's big differences between how we operate up in Canada and how you operate in Mexico, and all the other social issues and everything else that combined with it. So we ended up settling over here. We probably would have preferred being down in San Diego, a little further south, a little more light, but at that time there wasn't land available, and this just seemed like a great spot. So that's a bit of how we got here. Like I said, I live in Canada. I was born to Dutch immigrants in 1958. My parents immigrated after the Second World War, where there was a big flush of many Europeans that moved, particularly to Canada, because it was easier to land there. I grew up. I was the youngest son of 8 children, and grew up in a floral greenhouse. Never in my life did I think of doing anything different. I didn't contemplate going to university. I didn't contemplate on a lot of things. It just, even a different career really never was an option to me. Some of us are lucky, and I consider myself very fortunate to be in that position, to end up doing something that I love doing. And that's a challenge for a lot of us. kids, for our kids in particular, right? Finding out what you want, what niche do you want. Then at the end of the day, you find what you want to do, and you go through university for 3 or 4 years or 5 years and find out there's no jobs at the other end. So I do look back at myself and say I was very, very fortunate to be born in the right time and, with the right kind of opportunities and with parents that were doing something that I love doing. For those of you who have traveled around the world, there's many places in the world that aren't as blessed as we are. So I'll go back to starting over here. We bought some property, and we built the first 20 acres. That was in 1996, which was at that time not a lot of large-scale commercial-sized greenhouses in this county. 2 years later, we built 20 more acres, and then 2000 we built 44 more acres, and then 5 years ago we filled up the property. It's 160 acre property. It's now completely full with 125 acres. So I'll just move on to the next point. This is kind of builds on to what I just talked about how we feel about our company. I mean, this is something that I feel passionately about, and I want all of our employees to do the same. It doesn't always happen that way, but at the end of the day, we spend a lot of time at work. We want to love doing what we're doing if we can. On the other hand, it's still called work, so it's not, you don't love every bit of it, but you work in it, through it. So the next one is why a greenhouse? Oftentimes when we came down here, and, a Canadian looks at us and says, well, why are you building a greenhouse? Well, can't you grow all the time over there? It's always beautiful weather. They're watching TV. They're always in those days, they were watching the beach, what's that show, that TV show or something, where all the beach people were on anyway, whatever. There's probably a number of them. And I say, no, you can't. It still gets cold here. We are a long ways away from the equator. So to give you a little bit of an idea of how far north we are, in a wintertime, on a sunny day, we'll get about 1,200 joules of light on a perfectly sunny day in the middle of winter. Summertime, 3,200. So that gives you an idea. So you're almost a third of the light on a winter day compared to a summer day. And the equator doesn't have those kind of issues. You go up to Canada on a sunny day in the wintertime, you're going to get 450 joules. On a sunny day in the summer, you're up to 3,200, same as what you are down here. It's just that the days are more compressed. So that gives you a little bit of an idea. But the other thing is temperatures and climate. Tomatoes don't like Santa Anas. They don't like cold temperatures. They don't like high humidities. They don't like fog. They don't like a whole bunch of things that happens in nature. So we build greenhouses around it to protect them. Same reason we live in houses, because we don't, it's nice to be outside when it's nice weather, but it's not too good when it's not. So we try and create an ideal environment. You stop laughing over there. So we try and create an ideal climate for the plants. What does that do? Increases productivity, increases quality, increases consistency, and it makes production predictable. All of the things that we really need to do when we want to go to retail. Because 50 years ago, 60 years ago, a consumer never would think of buying tomatoes for Christmas. Now, even in Canada, people don't even think about where does their produce come from. And the fact that there might be snow outside, they're still going to walk into a store and want to buy strawberries and tomatoes. So, and if we want to stay in business and be viable doing what we're doing, we need to fill that demand. Because if we don't fill that demand as suppliers, somebody else will. So that's why we moved down here, and we understood how important it was to be in production 12 months out of the year. So we do that in the greenhouse. The other thing is, greenhouses are expensive. Cost to build a new ultra modern greenhouse today is about $1 million an acre. So you look at our facilities, 125 acres of greenhouses. The math's not too hard. It's $125 million to build a facility of that kind of nature. And then you start adding the toys. We'll see some of the toys that we have a little later that add on to that cost again. So how do you justify that kind of cost? through production, through all the issues I just talked about, production, quality, consistency of volumes and supply, so that the retailer comes and says, we want to do business with you. That's the first challenge a farmer has, is to try and create demand. The days when a farmer grew and people just came and bought it are long gone. There's overproduction of agriculture in the world, and if you don't supply it, somebody else will. Now, the other thing that's happening too, which is helping us now, is there's more and more people starting to understand what food miles are, what locally grown is, how important it is to the local communities, and that fresh food actually tastes better than food that's been, on the road for 3 or 4 days or flown in from Chile or whatever else it is. So those are all things that we want to work on. We want to make sure we put emphasis in being local and on moving forward. This is a picture of the inside of a greenhouse. It just shows a little bit of what it looks like. How many of you have been in our facility here? Quite a few of you. So this is all second nature to you. You guys know all this already. So it is a very interesting operation to see. The other thing is it's very high in production. So if you look at 125 acres of greenhouses, to supply the same amount of farm gate value in a tomato field in San Joaquin Valley, you need about 8,000 acres. So for every pound of tomatoes we produce, we use 1/6 of the water that a field tomato uses. So it's a use of resources. It's efficient. It does everything that we want it to do, but it's expensive. So it does need to demand a premium. We love doing what we're doing, but we can't do it at a loss. And the other thing is, it's expensive to operate in this county. Land prices are high. There's a whole bunch of other things that just make it a whole lot more expensive to operate. Housing prices is high. Labor is a little more difficult to get. And I can go on and on. I don't have to tell you about those. But there's other advantages, infrastructure advantages of being close to big cities and being close to a lot of suppliers and distribution. Distribution is very important. I talked a little bit about the toys that we put in our operation. I call them toys. A lot of other people call them other things. But when we built our last phase, we were in a little bit of a different situation. I'd been working in greenhouses for a long time. We built up some equity. So finally I could do a project where everything didn't quite have to balance. I could actually do what I wanted to do. That's why I call them toys. So we put in solar panel. Why did we do that? Because with the last 40 acres of greenhouses we built, I wanted it to be carbon neutral. So we put in the solar panels to supply the electricity. We put in thermal collectors in the roof of our warehouses to add more heat. We've taken our irrigation water and we've cooled it down and stripped the heat out of it to heat the greenhouse. So we got to a point where we're about carbon neutral on that newest greenhouse. We did it. It's very expensive, but we did do it. And let me tell you, it's fun. It gives you a bit of satisfaction, but not everyone has those kind of opportunities. And there's also challenges. The other thing, when you're very innovative, it is a lot more difficult getting permits and getting through what is standard in most applications. So we found some of those challenges, and I'll touch a little bit more on those later. But to give you an example, for these solar panels, when we got into the permitting process, the fire department wanted $91,000 fee for their portion. So we fought it, and we got to a point where we got it down to a much more doable amount. But those kind of challenges, when it's not done before, that's what you end up hitting. And it seems like all the time, and this is where many of you can help, is by understanding what we're doing, we won't have to go through those hurdles, because those hurdles are frustrating. They're frustrating for farmers. They're frustrating, I think, for everyone. So if we can make it easier, we all need permits. We all know that. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that we certainly need streamlined methods of getting permits through and timelines so it doesn't take as long to get projects done. Because time is money in our industry. When we need to react quickly. When Costco comes up to us and they say, this is what we need, and you tell them, well, maybe I can do it in 3 years, guess what? You just lost that order. So that's where time is really, it's important. The other thing is who's our competitors? Mexico's our competitor, our major competitor. Over 50% of the vegetables we eat today in America come out of Mexico today. And part of the reason is labor. You know, they're paying $1 an hour for farm laborers. If they want to build something, they don't even need to ask for permits. They don't need, we definitely don't want to go to that kind of society, not at all. But it does mean it's something that we have to compete against. So what we do, we need to do it better. We need to do it smarter. We need to utilize our staff better. We need to have higher productivity. So when you hear farmers complain sometimes, that's one of the reasons why they complain, is because competition is stiff and it's difficult. We've innovated, like I talked about, some of what we're doing here on the energy side. We've done it on labor. We've spent about $2 million on labor tracking systems and everything else to make sure that we're as productive as we possibly can be, and that we can maintain a labor force, because labor's not it's getting more and more difficult to go along as you move. Obviously, you can tell I'm not used to using PowerPoints. So the other thing we started this project about 3 years ago. One of the things that always, besides my passion for growing tomatoes and basically dealing with ag, some things that just drive me nuts, and it's waste. And we waste so much in America that it's almost a crime. And it's low-hanging fruit that has not been addressed. There's been a lot of emphasis on renewables. There's been a lot of push for solar, for wind, and for biogas and everything else. But there is so much waste, and that's far easier to collect on and do. Give you an example. We put more energy out of our industrial stacks in America than Japan uses as a nation. That's just one little stat. And when we looked at what we do, our highest cost in our operation is labor. Our second highest cost is heating. And our third highest cost is natural gas. Now, those percentages aren't quite the way they are today, because natural gas today is half the cost it was 5 years ago. And it's probably going to stay like that as long as fracking's around. But we, in our ultimate farm wisdom, decided that it was a good time to lock in gas for 10 years in a row, because I went through the Gray Davis blackout days, and the fear of high natural gas prices were always something that hangs over you. I remember one morning when I woke up, and I always checked the gas price, and it was $52 an MMBTU. Today it's $3.50. That price of gas was more than what our revenue per day was, the cost. So that kind of sticks. So we locked in for 10 years. So we're locked in right now in a market of about $8.50 an MMBTU, and we can buy it for $3.50. It's costing us about $1.2 million a year of that we otherwise would. But that's just part of what our business is. And why do I say that? It's because farming is so much more than farming. We need to know about political issues. We need to know about labor issues. We need to be dealing with legal issues. We need to know how to lobby and get permits. We need to know how to do financial statements. We need to know and understand HR. Our employees over here, we're running about 450 plus people. So that comes with a whole bunch of other issues. We have environmental issues that we have to deal with, and on and on and on. It becomes mind-boggling. You get to a point where You say there's so many laws and regulations out there, I must be breaking some today, and I don't even know about it. But those are challenges. And that's why I say farming isn't the same today as it was, 50 years ago, or definitely, certainly not the same as it was 100 years ago. When you can control your environment, you say, well, it's a lot easier to farm, isn't it, when you're in a greenhouse? It really isn't. Because that means you can start controlling it. That means you need to know what temperature is the best, what the humidity is the best, what kind of CO2 levels you want in a greenhouse, how are you going to operate your heating, how are you going to control your costs. And I can go on and on about all those things. The latest greenhouse we built it's one that we actually patented, and it's now being sold in countries like Australia and Turkey and Europe and parts of Mexico, and it's going all over the world. So there's technology that's being ag technology, and probably not only just in the greenhouse field, but in other fields, that's going all over the world and creating wealth and value for Ventura County, besides the agricultural production that it's doing. And we developed that technology because our conditions are different than the world's. The silicone of the world is basically Holland. That's where most of the greenhouse technology comes from, but their conditions and challenges are different than ours. They've never heard of a Santa Ana. So they never had to deal with those things. The amount of pests that we have and pressure over here, they don't have them over there. So we learn how to deal with them, and we've gone through our trials and errors with dealing with the bugs and viruses and everything else, and we've had to educate our way through. So you say, well, that's really very difficult, but there's some positive sides out of that. Out of adversity, a lot of times you think of new things of how you're going to get through. Most of the things in this world would never have been invented if there wasn't a problem. So that's what made us design this new greenhouse that dealt with bug pressures, that dealt with Santa Ana winds, that did all the things we wanted to do, and it's quite technically advanced. And it also gives us the ability to use low-grade heat. So getting back to the wasteful things we do, we actually looked to try and tie onto the Procter & Gamble plant down here. We also had discussions with the California State University to tap into that cogeneration, or that generation plant that they have over there, because we need heat and CO2, which Procter & Gamble has lots of excess that you can see going on the stack, and so does that one at Channel Islands. But the property next to the Procter & Gamble plant was $450,000 an acre, so it was just kind of out of reach. And the Channel Island, the university one was too difficult there. It couldn't get the land on the one side, and on the other side it was in the floodplain. And we built some in the floodplain. As you would know, I never want to build in the floodplain again. So what did we do? We couldn't tie into any of these plants, so we decided that we were going to bring electricity and generate our own electricity. So some five years ago, this became possible through an assembly bill that got passed in Sacramento called AB 6013. That mandated the Edisons of the world and any other power distributors that they were forced to buy cogenerated power that had above 80% efficiency rating on their units. To give you an idea of how efficient power that we produce here is when you look at the power plants that are over by just on the ocean there. What's the what was it? Mandalay. Yeah, Mandalay. The other one is the one by Oxnard. Those two plants run at about 34% efficiency. So that means of all the energy they're using, 34% of it's being converted to electricity. The rest is going out as waste heat and carbon dioxide and just inefficient plants. So we went and we bought, looked around the world for what was the best units. We ended up buying a GE plant out of Jenbach, Austria. It's an internal combustion engine. So it drives a generator, so we produce electricity. Sell electricity to the grid, or we use it on site. And then we strip all the heat off it. We use the heat for the greenhouse, and we take the CO2 off it and use the CO2. It's very expensive. We spent about $20 million putting that toy in. And it penciled. Except now comes the next thing. It was mandated by Sacramento, but Edison really didn't quite want it. So, it took forever to get to where we wanted to. It was supposed to be an 18-month project. About 3 years later, we're finished. And so we had about $10 million worth of equipment sitting on the ground for about 14 months not being used. And that doesn't look good. That doesn't look good when your bank's looking at your financial statements, and it doesn't feel very good when you've got all the equipment that's not being used. But we continue to work on it. I went to Sacramento about 4 times and lobbied, and went to meetings in Edison, and we worked very hard and diligently doing this. Now, part of the reason that it was so difficult is we were the first ones. Now, you consider that bill passed 5 years ago. We, just on the 1st of November, got tied on to that, what that bill allowed us to do. So that timeline gives you a little bit of an idea. Why is there nobody else doing it? Because it's a no-brainer. This plant runs at about 96% efficient. So you're using so much more of the energy, and that's why I talk about low-hanging fruit. So now we're there, but there's no one else doing it, because you can't bank stuff that you don't know how much it's going to cost and how long it takes. So that's whenever we talk about timelines within the county on permitting issues, we need to budget that. When we make financial projections, we need to say this is how long it's going to take us to build it. Because part of the time length is a big part of carrying costs of money and also what it takes. You can't earn any revenue until the project is completed. So those are really important things for government to remember. Time is the same as money. We would rather pay much higher fees, permitting fees, and know that we have fixed timelines that we can stay in, because then we can budget it properly. Then we know we won't have cost overruns. Because usually if a project takes twice as long, it costs twice as much money. But we worked hard. We got this thing done. We got the wires changed. And I'll tell you, this is where you learn what being a farmer is really like, because it was tough, and you needed to be very smart. So we fortunately have some really good people, smart people on staff that helped us get this, and that worked diligently together. I guess when things are as hard as they are, then it gives you a lot of satisfaction to have them done. So they're running today, operating on our plant. We're selling electricity, and we're saving a lot of energy. So the next, oops, I'm going the wrong way. Sorry about that. I've already talked about some of the challenges, so let's move on to some of the future opportunities. So I did mention something about Costco. Costco wants us to grow peppers in a greenhouse, because Costco now is bringing in a policy that they want all their tomatoes, peppers, and long-range cucumbers to be grown in greenhouses because of food safety issues. So we don't have any land, so we need to buy more land. By the time we buy that land, how long is it going to take us before we can ship to Costco? That's the question. We need to do a bunch more due diligence. Obviously, we've got to buy the land, and then the other thing is we've got water challenges that we need to get through. So that could be an upcoming project. But what we've done in the meantime, I did touch a little bit on tying into a power plant. We're actually going to be moving a facility. We're starting a new facility up in Salt Lake, just outside of Salt Lake City, Utah, where it ties onto a power plant. And that's in a state that is really, it's a food desert. There's not very many people up there growing anything, for good reason, because it gets minus 30 in the wintertime, and it gets, into the 90s in the summertime. But we can deal with that with a greenhouse. And because we're tapping into a heat source and a CO2 source without affecting the efficiency of the plant one bit. So we can heat that facility, we can use the CO2 without incurring any additional energy uses. Why wouldn't we be doing that more often? I'll just touch on that for a bit. That's just something we are going to do. And then we are looking at starting this another site here. It would be preferably next to our property. But that one's going to be a little longer because I imagine the timeline is probably going to be in the 2-year period before, by the time you get it and you go through your CUP and everything else. I think it'll be a lot easier than it was. That's one thing I should say positively about when we first started in '96 to where we are today. The county has learned a lot more about greenhouses. California has learned a lot more about greenhouses. The permitting stuff. And we've also learned a lot because we had to learn how to build in seismic. We had to teach the Dutch what seismic was. You know, and Dutch are kind of easygoing people for those of you who don't know Dutch, but they would always say, "Oh, I want to build a greenhouse." And said, "Well, it has to be up to seismic 4." Well, don't worry about that, you know. But we have to worry about that, and we want to worry about that because the last thing we want is if there's an earthquake and there's people in our greenhouses that the thing comes down. So we're as concerned about that as anybody else. So, you know, I applaud the county for doing things like that because I think those are important to all of us. So I think I probably spoke enough. I don't know if there's any questions.
I have one little one.
Yes.
You turn the lights on at night.
Yes.
And obviously you must measure the joules, and if you don't get enough during the daytime, you turn the lights on at night. How do you control it?
It's basically scheduled by day length. And the reason we do it is to flatten out the peak. Now, I talked to you a little bit about how much light we have in the winter and how much we have in the summer. We want to flatten it out because we don't produce enough in the wintertime. It's a challenge, even down here, because our production numbers are less than 50% in the wintertime than they are in the summertime. Well, you tell that to the buyer, the produce buyer, well, he'll jump out of his skin. What do you mean you can't supply me? These guys oftentimes are moved from clothing to produce to whatever else it is, and maybe they understand, but they don't care. They want to get their job done. We've had mergers upon mergers, so the retailers are getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And as they get bigger, they don't necessarily expand their buying offices. In most cases, they don't. So the pressure is greater and greater on the buyers, and it gets downloaded onto the farmers. So we have a choice. Either we import product or outsource it from Mexico, or we grow it, try and increase our productivity to level out our volume. We do it in Canada. We've put all lights in the same thing. We're also putting in cogeneration up there. And that's the primary reason why you do it, is to try and level out your production levels so you can supply your customer. We have a policy within our organization that I would say I wouldn't know any other company that has the same thing that's producing greenhouse vegetables anyway, is if our name's on it, we've grown it. There's many other brands out there that cover a lot of products, and you look on it, and one time it's out of Mexico, the next time it's from the U.S., the next time it's from somewhere else. We don't do that. Anybody that buys our product, they know we've grown it, we've taken care of it, and we've watched over it. We think that's important. Well, we produce tomatoes 365 days a year. So we have a technique called interplanting. And that means we plant young plants in between the old plants. So when the old plant is finished picking, the young plant takes over right away after that. Because I can't tell the buyer that we're in interplant right now. Sorry, I can't supply you this week. So we've worked hard at. There's a lot of systems. There's a lot of technology and a lot of time gone into to developing all those periods, the methodology and everything else. We can't copy it from somewhere else. Yes.
That plant out there seems like a perfect neighbor as far as environmentally, community, with all the jobs you provide, assistant, so it's not transitional labor. Those people live in the community, they spend in the community. About the only thing I've ever heard questions about, the light at night. Is there any technology that could capture some of that light and reuse it, some coating, or is it something that ever come up? You get concerned about it? And I'm not that it's bad. It's just it's obviously noticeable out there, especially if you're somebody who's
Yeah, and it is. There is technology out there. except there's one problem. It's too warm here at night because the lights give off heat, and you have to get rid of the heat. So we have the same issue in Canada, and Holland has got lights coming all over the place because they're even further north than we are in Vancouver. And there's been a lot of work done on it, but that's the big challenge: is what do you do with the heat? Because anytime you want to stop the light, you're stopping the air movement. Yes. No, it was just of us going through the whole process and finding out, okay, there's no people in here, there's none of this, so you got to find the right kind of classification for it so that it doesn't fall under, it's all steel and everything else. So we work with Jensen Design out here to find ways of how to mitigate it. But that's frustrating when you got to do those kind of processes. And we've done a few of them. We've done a lot of them with Edison. Yes.
How do you see the trend in crops? I mean, I know I see a lot of nurseries now. Do you see a different trend for tomatoes in the next 10 years?
In greenhouses? Well, as far as vegetables are concerned, you're going to see tomatoes, long-English cucumbers, some mini cucumbers, maybe eggplant. And peppers, bell peppers are big. So those are the ones that you'd find the most area in. There's anything else that's done in greenhouses, all the way from radishes to strawberries and raspberries and all those other kind of things. I think probably, and it depends on how many years you start looking forward, where you see all these raspberry tunnels that are out here. It's a matter of time before that stuff's all in greenhouses, because the rain is devastating on them, and the productivity per acre goes way up, and the water use goes way down. The water's going to be an issue. We're going to have to use water better. And the other thing is land use. They're not making any more of it. They keep building more houses, and they keep making wide roads and everything else, and it all consumes property. And we want parks, and we want recreation land. We want all the things that we all want. So to intensify this kind of ag production means it's better for the environment because you have no runoff. So you don't have the same kind of pollution issues you do. Your pesticide use is fractions. So, and it produces year-round employment. And the other thing it does, besides producing year-round employment, it adds about, our property tax, about $1.5 million a year that goes into the coffers here. Yes? Absolutely. Absolutely. A field tomato plant will produce for probably 4 or 5 weeks. And then by that time it's done. We have plants that will produce for a year. But we do a lot to do it. They're grafted. Every single tomato plant we grow is grafted on a rootstock, so it's much stronger. It can last a lot longer. We pair them all up. So there's 100 years of technology in this. And the further we get, you always think, well, now we've hit it. We haven't. There still keeps coming more and more, and sometimes you just think, when's this ever going to stop? But I guess the world is complex, and nature's very complex. And as we get further and further on, we find other ways to do things better, more efficiently, and move on.
I haven't been there yet, love to go there. The tomatoes, it looks like it's, 30 feet tall each plant? It's a vine, correct?
One stem, the main stem, and then every week it produces a cluster of tomatoes and grows longer and longer. So we have it on hooks. I think you can see it in one of these.
Yeah, the one photo. So, like a vertical harvest?
Let me see this one here. Yeah. So the stem, the plant will actually get to about 35 feet long before it's done.
So you're collecting tomatoes?
We always pick low-hanging fruit. See, the flowers are at the top, and you lower them down as they get longer. Bumblebees pollinate them.
So cucumber plant would work well.
Yep.
thinking of a bell pepper, I've never seen a pepper as a vine, so what I'm getting at is the space. Being that in a greenhouse, you can't have vertical growing of peppers or radishes, right? It's just on the-
You can. You can. The difference, peppers and tomatoes are same family.
Oh,
But peppers take a lot longer to grow up. They're a lot more woody. So basically, you can have them for 9 or 10 months, and they'll be maybe 14 feet tall or something like that by that time. But we have all carts that run on their battery-powered ones, so that you're at the right level, and all this other kind of automation that goes through. We have robots. We've got all kinds of fancy things. For those of you who like, your electric trains and that kind of stuff when you were a kid, we have them in full size. Yes. It goes into, well, the leaves go to a ranch. The cows eat them. Cows love tomato leaves. I don't know why. Last time I tasted them, they weren't too good. But and the vines actually get chopped up, and they go to Agriman. So they get composted. Now, you could actually put them to a biodigester, but you need huge volumes to be able to do that. Yes. Oh, the contract's 450 pages thick. And when I read it, I fall asleep on the second page. Heretofore and therein as much. It's 10 years, and and then with a renewable clause in it. But it's based on AB 6013, where the rate is set by the California Public Utility Commission, and it's based on spark spread. So the price of natural gas is the line that determines what the price you're going to get for electricity. So the higher the gas is, the higher the electricity price goes. So from an investment perspective, the risk is not in the electricity contract. The risk is in how much is the interconnection fees going to cost. In our case, it was $5 million. Could be way more. It depends on where you are. Depends on how long it is, how long it takes. And it depends on how smart you are. Because if you know what you're doing, and you know and can anticipate those problems beforehand, you can cut a lot of time off it. But we were new at it. We had a lot of teething issues. And Edison never did it before either, so a lot of the rules and stuff all kind of got invented on the way in. I was maybe a little hard on Edison, but there's reasons for both ways, I guess. Yes? We do a lot, but we don't breed tomato seed. Most of these seeds come out of Holland, out of the greenhouse industry. They're bred specifically for the greenhouse industry. There's roughly, there's probably about 10 major seed companies in the world that produce seeds. There used to be many, many, many more. Monsanto has bought up probably 6 or 7 of the larger ones. Now you're seeing Israeli companies and Spanish companies. There's a few smaller ones. There's not an awful lot of actually breeding and facilities in the United States because there's not a lot of greenhouses here comparatively to what there is in the rest of the world. Yes?
You said that Costco's proposing to buy from you because they believe that the produce is safer growing in a greenhouse more. Is that just because it's in the greenhouse, or do you use some special things to keep contaminants out? Or?
All of the above.
Okay.
Well, basically what it is when you're in a field, you have birds, you have pests, you have to use a lot more insecticides, you can have water issues, rodents, whatever else it is. So we're in a much more controlled environment. So from a food safety perspective, it reduces a lot of the potential issues by a large degree. Yes?
I was going to ask, how do you deal with the pests inside of your greenhouse? I know I have 3 plants in the backyard. They're looking sad now, but usually I have like 3 tomato plants in my backyard, and those little green worms that aren't so little, just can't stand them.
We love them worms because they eat all those little tomato plants in your backyard. Well, what we do, the first thing you do is prevention. Wherever possible, avoid it. The last 2 greenhouses we designed are pressurized. So when the door is open, the wind goes out, blows it out. The other thing we do is every ventilation area where air has to go through has got insect screen on it. Keep them out. Because when that farmer next door is done with his lima beans, and there's 100 million whitefly living in that thing, guess where they're going to go? They're going to go somewhere where there's food. We don't want them. So that the bees are inside. And they're bumblebees. Bumblebees. And bumblebees are not very smart. Honeybees are very smart. They always go for the best flowers. And tomatoes don't have very good pollen. But bumblebees don't care. So we use bumblebees. They're actually, the hives are commercially bred in Chicago. And they fly them over here, and we put them in our greenhouse to pollinate. And they can't get out because there's insect screen. But they wouldn't. They'd be too dumb to get out anyway. So that's the prevention part of it. And then very early detection. So once every 10 days, 2 weeks, there's scouts that go through and check the whole house. Find out what it is. If there's something in a little area, treat it, get rid of it right away. The thing we hate the most is viruses, because we never go empty. So it's really important that we keep everything out. If a 20-acre greenhouse, if we have to replant it, clean it out and replant it because there's disease in there, it's about a $2 million bill. We don't like that. So we do use some pesticides, but primarily we try and stick with biologicals. But when there's virus pressures, you got to be very careful. The other thing is, there's psyllid in this county. You probably never heard of that ugly thing. That's a different one. We have the potato psyllid that goes in tomatoes, and the citrus, the green thing is. But they're evil, and there's no predators yet, commercially available predators for them. But one of the problems with the citrus is, citrus is great for those of you who love them. But it's when a psyllid goes onto a plant and bites it, it stops growing. So you can say, well, I got psyllids in the greenhouse. It's too late already. There's a lot of damage done. So but they're bigger, so they're easier to screen out. But you do have to be, if you get them, you got to nail them right away. Any other? Yes. Well, this is kind of an unknown fact. A lot of people might know it, but CO2 is the most important fertilizer a plant has. But we don't look at it that way because it comes out of the air. What happens in a greenhouse, if you don't dose CO2, the plants will eat the CO2 out of the air to such a low level that they actually stop growing because there's no more available CO2 unless there's enough air exchanges. So that's why we supplement with CO2. Because if we can raise our level from ambient, which is around 350 or 360, and bring it up to 700 or 800, we can increase our productivity by about 25%. Now that's a number with variables in it because it depends on what the stress is and all these other kind of things. But that's why CO2 is really important for us. What the plant uptake is, it depends on the air exchanges in the greenhouse. So the hotter it is, the more air exchanges you have to do, the more CO2 that gets wasted outside. But probably, somewhere around between 30 and 50% of the injected CO2 gets absorbed. But it's a big nut. It's a lot. And that's one thing also when we talk about global warming and increasing CO2 levels. You're going to see significant increases in agriculture production because the outside CO2 levels are going up. Oh, we do it on parts per million. So we try and maintain, let's say, 700 or 800 ppm. So the lower the levels go, the higher we dose it. And also, it's also a tool we use to control generative and vegetative balances. But we're getting pretty complex. If you really want to know more about that, ask that guy over there in the black T-shirt. He knows all about it. Actually, I'll just introduce him. That's Martin Whiters. He was our grower that came in 1996. We imported him out of Holland, paid the duties and airfare and all that other stuff, and we brought him in. So he knows everything about what we all went through. For those of you who remember when we had the El Nino year, his mobile home where he was living on site, it burnt down in 6 feet of water. So he's gone through everything. All right. Any other questions?
Well, thank you.
All right. Okay. I'll make one more comment. If somebody wants to have a tour, if you organize it out of the county here and get as many people together as you can for a tour, it makes it a lot easier for us, because we have 350 people come through a week on average, and it taxes. It taxes a lot of our abilities. We want everyone to be proud of what we're doing here. We're proud of it. We think the county should be proud of it. We're glad to be part of this community. We want you to be glad to have us here. One other comment I'll make, too, is when we did come down here, we are Canadians. We're a Canadian company. We're cognizant of that. So what we did was, wherever possible, we used locals for irrigation and construction and whatever else we could. And I think we become more of a community-minded people because of that. I think it's very important to be part of the community.